very much, and welcome back after coffee to you all. Delighted to have been asked to chair this first thematic panel of the annual conference, and I'm really delighted that we're here to discuss a topic which is an enormously important one as we think about the ever more effective performance of the financial sector and the insurance sector, and related to that of financial and insurance regulators. And that is the topic of embedding diversity, equity and inclusion for better consumer and prudential outcomes. My name is Jerry Cross. I am the Director for Financial Regulation, Policy and Risk at the Central Bank of Ireland. And diversity, equity and inclusion are a really high priority issue for us, both in how we approach regulation and the supervision of the financial system, and in how we look at our own functioning and optimal performance as a central bank and regulator. At the Central Bank of Ireland, we are an integrated central bank and regulator. We regulate all financial sectors, and we regulate them for stability, prudential and conduct purposes. And although Ireland is a relatively small country, we have a large financial services sector which is active internationally and, of course, widely throughout Europe. We are very clear what our mission as a regulator is. It is to regulate the financial system to ensure that it performs optimally to support the Irish and European and international economies, and that it serves the interests of Irish, European and international consumers. And it's because of this very outcomes-focused perspective that we are such strong adherents of the view that diversity and inclusion matter enormously in how we go about our business. We are fully persuaded by the view and by the evidence that firms who pay effective attention to these issues are on the whole better run and more effective in the achievement of their objectives. And this is, of course, one of the topics that we'll be focusing on closely today. And we are also strongly of the view that as a medium-sized public authority, not only will we be more effective if we embed diversity, equity and inclusion in our own organisation, but given that we are a public authority which cannot always compete head-to-head on financial remuneration with private sector actors, it is hugely important both that we are able to access all of the talent that is available to us in society, and once we have recruited such talent, that by embracing its diversity and allowing every single individual to feel included and belonged in the organisation, we allow our talent to flourish and we are able to retain that talent. Now, as a member of the IAIS Exco, I'm also really delighted to see that inclusion, diversity and equity are a key aspect of the IAIS's strategy and programme. In 2021, the IAIS adopted diversity, equity and inclusion as one of its key strategic themes and published a statement recognising the importance of these aspects in insurance supervision. In a page and a half, this statement manages to say a huge amount. It is well worth a read. The IAIS Governance Working Group and the Market Conduct Working Group are jointly engaged on a project focused on DEI within insurers and on the way they conduct their businesses, and particularly the activity underway by insurance supervisors and others to promote diversity, equity and inclusion in the insurance sector. A public report on this stocktake will be published later this year. And recommendations for further work by the IAIS on this topic will be set out in our roadmap, which will be published early next year and will include the work programme for 2023-24. Now, that is enough from me. Let me turn now to introduce our panellists and get the conversation going. And I'm delighted to be joined by four panellists who are not only enormously distinguished in their own rights, but also bring a deep expertise and wide range of insights into the topic of diversity, equity and inclusion. And they are participating virtually. We have first of all Helen Roll. Helen is Deputy Chair of the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, APRA, and Helen is also IAIS Champion for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion. Welcome, Helen. Also participating virtually, we have Fundi Chasibana. Fundi is Deputy Governor of the South African Reserve Bank and CEO of the South African Prudential Authority. Welcome, Fundi. Participating in the physical room, we have immediately to my left, Francisco Pancho Estelara. Pancho is Secretary General of the Inter-American Federation of Insurance Companies. Welcome, Pancho. And to my far left, Clora Lindley-Myers. Clora is Director of the Missouri Department of Insurance, Financial Institutions and Professional Registration. Welcome, Clora. So, turning to our first round of discussions and to our first polling question, and you will have been explained a moment ago how to open the polls on your mobile devices through the QR scan. So we're now ready to go to that first question, which is, in your jurisdiction, is the insurance sector engaged on the topic of diversity, equity and inclusion? And there are 4 choices: yes to a great extent, yes somewhat, only a little, or not at all. So while you are voting, I will turn to our first discussion and we'll come back to the results in a few moments. So Helen, if I may first of all turn to you, and I'll wait till I see you back on the screen, which may take a few seconds. There you are. Helen, as I mentioned, you are the IAIS champion for diversity, equity and inclusion. Perhaps you could start the discussion just a little by updating us on the IAIS work in this area.
Thanks, Jerry, and hello, everyone. And let me start by saying how disappointed I am that I could not be there in person with you. I hope you're all having a great event. I'm sure it will be fabulous. So, as Jerry mentioned, the IAIS did release a statement on the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion late last year. And since then, it's been undertaking work with 2 sort of core focuses, one more external and one more internal. On the external front, we undertook a major survey where we invited all our member jurisdictions to share input on their work in the diversity, equity and inclusion space. What were their achievements and priorities, and how did they think the insurance industry in their jurisdiction was doing, and what was the focus of the industry itself on DE&I. We will be publishing a report on that stocktake survey very shortly. But what the good level of responses did highlight to us was that there is a very keen interest in this subject across many jurisdictions, and that despite the competing challenges and resource constraints that most supervisors face, there was a strong sense that with some guidance, some good sharing of good practices and leveraging the experience of others on possible ways to take initiatives forward, that good progress can be made on DE&I. And we've also undertaken some industry stakeholder engagement at the same time, and that has suggested that the insurers and insurance bodies and around the world would also welcome some support from regulators in progressing DE&I considerations, whether that's through case studies or peer analysis or the like, and doing it through those means rather than necessarily taking a rules-based approach. But the more internal-facing work that we've been doing in DE&I is about how does the IAIS as an organisation incorporate diversity, equity, inclusion considerations into the way it operates and conducts itself as an organisation. And we also asked some questions about what we should do in that regard in the stocktake survey that we recently undertook, and also sought some information on how supervisors were actually focusing on DE&I within their own organisations. What was their experience and what was their approach? So we've just yesterday released another statement from the IAIS, which really affirms the commitment of the IAIS to improving how we embed diversity, equity and inclusion within our governance and processes as an association, because we really do see this as a critical enabler of the IAIS achieving its missions and its objectives as a prudential standard, an insurance standard setter. So our strategy, both on the internal and external front, will be informed by an ongoing program of stakeholder engagement, both IAIS members and also more broadly across other stakeholders. And we would just encourage all of you to continue to share your views and insights with each other and with us so that we can all learn and move forward together. Thanks, Jerry.
Thanks, Helen. Maybe if I could just ask you one question by way of follow-up. In that stocktake work that you carried out I think really a really interesting piece of work. Did you find a lot of divergence in terms of starting points and where different jurisdictions are at? I mean, we're going to turn to that topic now in a moment, but what was the initial sense, and how do you, I mean, do you have any reaction to what you found in that regard?
Yeah, I think there were a range of perspectives and priorities, and clearly some jurisdictions had much more of a focus and had made much more progress than others, and there were a variety of reasons provided for that. Some of them felt that there may be some limitations in their mandates for making more progress. For some of them, it's simply a resource and priority issue, and then others had felt that actually it was critically important and had taken significant steps to drive it forward. And I think that's understandable given the range of issues and the range of jurisdictions that are IAIS members, and therefore we would expect there to be a spectrum of approaches and priorities. But I think the pleasing thing was the pretty wide recognition that it was important. It did contribute to better outcomes and better governance and better decision makings, and therefore it was an area that the IAIS should continue to focus on and drive forward.
Thanks, Helen. Fundy, if I may turn to you. Within the South African context and the context of the Reserve Bank, how is that topic of diversity, equity and inclusion understood? Do you have a particular focus, particular approach, and is there a sort of dominant theme for you at the moment?
Yeah, so thanks very much, Jerry. I am so happy to see everyone albeit on screen. So just a bit of context in the South African, just through the South African lens, to say that for historical reasons, racial inequality has been a prominent feature and characteristic of South African society and the economy. And this presents itself in a number of areas such as equality of education, skills inequality, pay inequality. So we have found ourselves in this unique position, and therefore we might be one of the few jurisdictions that have got legislated transformation, as we call it, that focused a lot more on equality more than other elements of diversity. So we've got prescribed targets that are in law around racial and gender representation, as well as touching on areas such as skills development, among others. And over time, some of the targets have moved in the legislative framework to include including individuals with disabilities, and now we have youth that is included. So these are things that are featured in legislation. In addition to legislation, we have got sectoral compacting that recognizes that different sectors of the economy had slightly varied challenges. And I would say that the social compacting elements have worked better in other sectors more than others. And then also we've got a governance layer, which is through our King Code of Corporative Governance that includes some aspirations that relate to diversity and inclusion. Now, turning to the Prudential Authority itself and the South African Reserve Bank, we ourselves have to comply to these legislative targets, and there are reports that we have to prepare to our Department of Employment and Labour on an annual basis. Insurers have to comply to the same requirements as well. But in the Insurance Act, we do highlight the importance of transformation, but balanced against the objectives of promoting and enhancing safety and soundness. So as a supervisor, how we supervise the entities is we just ensure that they try to comply, but work with them in terms of achieving the necessary targets. I would say that in more recent years, we have started to see a more broadening of what does diversity and inclusion look like, and what is it in practice. And we have seen in practice probably more progress in the sector. It started off in the sales team, because if one aligns with who you're selling to, I think sales teams tend to be the first areas to be more representative, but we're starting to see movement in terms of representativity in management teams, among other areas, and now more strongly in the board context. We'd have to be very mindful of a supervisor of finding the right balance around the legislated targets, alongside how we work with the sector to prioritize safety and soundness, while working on a talent pool that will enable them to get to a better mix of diverse employees, a diverse board, and having product offerings that are appealing to broader society as well. So let me stop there, but it certainly has been a journey for us that started around 2003 in terms of what is diversity and inclusion in South Africa. But I would say that equality is the more prominent part of how we think about diversity, equality, and inclusion. But we slowly are starting to broaden the lens.
Thanks, Fundi. That's so interesting. So let me see if I've got it a little bit right. I'm sure I haven't. But so the sort of the first big part of the story around equality, you use those two words, legislation and transformation. It was a very determined, legislatively grounded drive. And then you've described how moving into diversity and the expansion of the concept, you like that second part, if I could ask, sort of the expansion into diversity and inclusion, is that more driven by your supervisory and regulatory perspective, or is that also coming from a kind of a legislative foundation, or that's more in your local hands, let me say?
Yeah, I would say it's coming more strongly through the legislative foundation. Because if I look at legislative compliance, we did start off being able to tick a few boxes. But as one looked at entities and institutions about, well, is this meaningful diversity? I think it became clear very early on that in some areas you would get compliance as a tick box exercise. But getting diversity and inclusion as the culture imply that certain things have to be done. So in terms of supervisory culture, I would say it's come more naturally to us in that way, because we're looking at, well, what are these individuals doing and what is the value add? Are they being rotated? Are they learning the business of the entity? So I think it's come through a lot more strongly through the supervisory approach rather than the legislative requirements themselves.
Thanks, and I like that. I think that's a phrase for us to hang on to, that phrase you use of meaningful diversity. I think that's a really nice way of putting it. Clora, maybe if I can turn to you, and what about the sort of similar question for you? How is this question of diversity, inclusion, equity, how is that considered and approached in your context in Missouri? Is it well established in the context of the insurance sector and its supervision, and other particular areas of focus for you?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to provide some comments. In Missouri, as in a lot of the states, when you look at our regulatory system and our structure, insurance in general is a reflection of the society it's aiming to protect. And so what that means is that as more opportunities are available, people are trying to avail themselves of various coverages, and everybody doesn't look the same. And so what we're looking at, certainly in Missouri and through the NAIC as a whole, is it's a priority to look at some of these issues and make sure that the people that we are trying to protect are actually getting protection and actually have and are able to avail themselves of the particular products. In particular, we have work streams through the NAIC. Work streams 1 and 2 are tasked with researching and analyzing the level of diversity and inclusion within the insurance industry. This isn't something that's new for us. It has been a painful process, through the years, looking at where we are, where we should be, and how far is it to get a little bit farther, to make sure that we are making sure that everybody is receiving coverage, everybody is receiving a fair shake. By its definition, insurance may be discriminatory. If you drive your car and you have accidents every month, of course you're going to be charged, no matter what you look like, you're going to be charged more. But I think, making sure that people have the products available, and that those products are not, they're not indistinguishable based on what you look like. And so those are the things that, we're looking at in work streams 3, 4, and 5 of the NAIC's Race and Insurance. We are looking at practices and barriers which might exist in the insurance sector that potentially disadvantage people of color and people who have been historically disadvantaged, either in groups or just the fact that they are they come to this country and people don't know that much about them. So it's like, well, we got to add a factor on there because we're not quite sure what to expect. So I think that the advent of more data, the advent of making sure that people are being treated properly, it's what we're focused on and have been focused on for a while. Certainly for me, it has been a focus, and it's obvious why. Because there have been instances where you're not judged by, your record, or you have to create a record in order to be judged by it. So I do think that, one of the things that we are looking at is making sure that there is some leveling of the review that we are doing, and we are asking our companies, and many are stepping up to the plate to make sure that they do that.
Thanks, Laura. Again, some very thought-provoking things in what you've said there. I'm really struck by the very first thing you said there, which I think is powerful, which is that you said that the insurance is a reflection of the society it tries to protect. I think that's a very sort of significant way or aspect to bring into the discussion. And I think also how you described the driver of your work in this area. I mean, it's very much in that space that I think I talked about at the beginning. I think we would all share, which is in our role as regulators and supervisors, what we are interested in is the outcomes. We're not doing this for our own good. We're not doing it for the profitability of a particular sector. We do what we do for the outcomes we seek to achieve. And can I just ask you a similar question that I asked Fundy? How much of your activity in this space would you say sort of comes from a legislative underpinning, and you feel it's sort of it's driven by legislation, and how much do you feel that supervisors and regulators have to take the baton yourselves and drive things forward, if you like, from the regulatory and supervisory perspective?
Maybe unlike Fundy, it's the legislative, there is a legislative base and has been for a while. It's whether or not it has been acknowledged and actually utilized. So there is a legislative base there in that there are laws that says you can't discriminate based on certain qualifications, but and race is one of them. But disability, the fact that people might be disabled or whatever. So I do think that we have a little bit more of an edge on the conversation that Fundy started out and was talking about it. But I do think that a lot of times, you could find instances of where the laws are there, it's just not being followed.
Thanks, Laura. Pancho, thank you for your patience. I turn to you now with more or less a same question, which is trying to focus in on sort of the perspective that you have from your local jurisdiction. But of course, in your case, that's quite a wide. You represent quite a wide area of geography. But what's your perspective on this, on the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion from your own perspective?
Good afternoon to all. Thank you for the IAIS for inviting me to be part of this high-level panel. So now I go to your answer, Jerry. The diversity, equity, and inclusive is understood in our region as a relevant goal to work. As background, we can mention that it is one of the United Nations SDG number 5 has been recognized as a key pillar of the G20's work. It is a key contributor to poverty alleviation, financial resilience, and economic growth. We need to lead the way towards a more inclusive and equitable societies. Being in an IAIS panel, it's important to mention that you also issued a statement recognizing the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And your considerations are that it's one of the main objectives of insurance supervision and consequently to the IAIS mission. It leads to better governance and decision-making, reduces the risk of group thinking, better meets consumer needs, prevents discriminatory practices, and reduces misconducts. And we have to mention also that financial inclusion and access to insurance has been a dominant topic in Latin America in the past years, are being goals and subjects of considerable work. Diversity and equity are becoming, and we hope that will become, dominant topics in the future. It's important to mention that up to now we have been more focused, as I mentioned, in insurance inclusion, more than in diversity and in equity.
Thank you, Pancho. Really useful to get that established in this context. Maybe let me, I'm conscious of falling a little bit behind already. Let me turn to the results of our first poll, if I can ask the team to put those up. So in your jurisdiction, is the insurance sector engaged in the topic of diversity, equity, inclusion? So quite an interesting distribution. So yes, somewhat. Coming in pretty strongly in front at 37%, only a little 28%, yes to a great extent 25%, and not at all 9%. So on the whole, between the yes somewhat and yes to a great extent, we have over 60%. Oh, what happened there? Yeah, still over 60% in the positive. But again, I think the fact that we've got quite a material, only a little or not at all, reflects what Helen was saying, which is that we are starting from very different perspectives, both in terms of the realities on the ground, as we've been discussing from our various panelists in the kind of geographical, historical situation, and also I suspect in terms of the engagement and the discussion, which is at times a difficult enough discussion in these areas. What is the role of insurance regulation supervision in this space? Similar to, someone made the point to me earlier today, sort of feels a little bit like some of the discussions we had around climate and the role of financial regulators in climate and sustainable finance. So interesting. And maybe we'll go straight to the second poll just to keep that ball rolling. So second poll is, to what extent does greater diversity, and I think this is really goes to the heart of the matter, to what extent does greater diversity, in your view, lead to better governance and decision making? And again, we've got our 4-point choice. Yes, it leads to significantly better governance and decision making, leads to marginally better governance and decision making, has no impact, is not relevant. So that is interesting. Be honest as to what you think. It'll be interesting to see. So let me now then turn. Let me turn again to Helen. But again, we're back there. Helen, why do we consider, and what do you think the supporting evidence is for equity, inclusion, diversity within an insurer having a positive impact on governance and risk management? What's your experience in this space?
Thanks, Jerry. Look, I mean, I think in Australia, and as we've seen through the stocktake results in many other jurisdictions, I think there is a general view that financial services and insurance in particular, in fact, all parts of corporate sector and regulators can benefit from stronger DEI practices and culture. And I think it is because of that link between a focus on DEI and the culture and behaviours that flow from that. And so, our view would be that it is fundamental to ensuring that the financial system is better able to do its role in supporting the economy by having well-run entities and sound markets that can respond to the diverse needs of the community, and it contributes to resilience because it brings together different views and perspectives so that opinions and ideas can be challenged, and you do get better outcomes, better governance, better risk management. And I think we've seen that cited in a number of different research reports. And also, I think if you're tapping into better decisions, better diversity of views, then you're going to get diverse perspectives that actually come up with better solutions and better ideas, and therefore better products, better services, better outcomes for consumers, and hopefully stronger and more resilient institutions. And there's also enough examples where sort of a weak focus on DEI that contributes to a weak culture or a poor culture and governance can actually lead to poor outcomes, poor decision making, losses and poor outcomes for consumers. And I think my experience recently through a number of sort of what I'd call Australian case studies would be that when we found issues in institutions and we see how they respond to those issues and the approach they take to addressing the issues and remediating the issues, there can be quite a stark difference between the insurers that really embrace and respond and try and build the remediation and the change in approach into their culture and their governance and their way of operating, and those that don't and that see it as a bit more of a compliance exercise and what do we have to do to get that regulator off our back. And I think when I reflect on the boards and the senior management and the culture and approach of those two different types of organisations, I think I do see a very clear connection between those that really believe in the value of diversity, equity and inclusion and a sound culture and building a robust culture within the organisation, and they embrace and really learn and make sure that the changes that we want to see in governance and risk management are embedded and driven right down through the organisations, whereas the ones that sort of push back and don't have that same focus, they're the ones where you actually really don't get the dial shifting and you don't get the embedment. And so for me, those couple of sort of real live case studies that I've seen in recent years of how organisations respond demonstrate for me the clear link between diversity, equity, inclusion, culture, behaviour, outcomes.
Thanks, Ella. Actually, I should say that resonates very strongly with me. We did in Ireland. We did a thematic review of diversity and inclusion in the insurance sector in the last 2 years, and a very similar set of findings and perspectives, I think, arising out of that. And so in what you say, I note a couple of things. One is that really important, and increasingly important trope for regulators and supervisors, the culture versus compliance kind of perspective that we find within firms, and how important it is to try and shift things towards the cultural end of the spectrum. And then in what you said, I picked up two things I think is really, really helpful and relates a little bit to what Clora said. One is you were almost talking about a correlation. You were talking about a correlation between what you find in the space of diversity, inclusion, equity, and what you find in how a firm responds to challenge. And then also the causation piece. I mean, you also then talked about where you have diverse perspectives, you causally will get, in general, better decisions because you're harnessing more perspectives. So I think those are two very, very helpful concepts again for us to bring into our discussion. Let me turn, which I will do now when I open my mouth. Let me turn to Clora, if I may. So you spoke a little bit there in the first round, Clora, about sort of that, the reflection of society and the insurer, and you talked about your focus on ensuring outcomes that are fair and non-discriminatory. Turning to the sort of the question of governance and decision making within the firms you regulate, how have you seen diversity as a component of high quality decision making and risk management, and do you have examples of that?
Yeah, I guess for me it's looking at the consumers and making sure that they're not neglected or disenfranchised. Getting out into the community. A lot of it is education. Getting out into the community, understanding what's going on in the community. There are some that believe that, well, I'm not able to get this type of coverage because, and there is an answer to the because. And the thought is that either the companies may not be offering those services in those communities. There might be reasons that are not particularly related to DE&I efforts, but you need to know that. You need to get out into the community and understand that. And so what that means is that if you have, when I'm looking at a company, I'm looking at the makeup of the company, who's making those decisions. If it's made by one demographic, it's excluding a lot of others. And so that could be concerning to me as to, how are you able to properly cover and provide coverages for your consumers if they don't all look like you? So what are you doing at your company to do that? So I do have conversations with my carriers. I do have conversations with them about what coverages they're offering, why they're offering it, and why they may or may not be excluding it in certain communities. I think those things are important. I do think the uniqueness for me in the United States of state-based systems of regulation, it allows us to see different areas, look at different areas, and things that might or might not be going on in Missouri might be in Alaska or in California. And so having sort of a truly a diverse view by not only me in my state, but also other regulators in other states and other jurisdictions, I think help me be a better regulator and help me take care of the people of Missouri better. And then any ideas that I might pass on to other states, they might be able to use that effectively in their jurisdiction.
Clora, thank you. And again, I mean, I see a very direct causal nexus in what you're describing there, which is your outcomes that you want in the community, the decisions that determine those outcomes, and those decisions having to be effectively reflective of different perspectives.
Correct.
To get them. Can I ask, is that view then well received in general, I don't ask for it, but by the firms you regulate? Or do you find...
I mean, I think for some, yes. For others, no. And there are reasons for that. And, and a lot of times, people feel, hey, I know best. I'm not willing to take in another idea or another thought. I'm not open to that. So it's going to be a little bit more of a hurdle. as a regulator for me to get through to that insurer or that firm than it would be maybe to someone who might be a bit more open to it. But I do think that if they're not as open, they will see where people will migrate from insurance company X to insurance company Y because they get a better deal there. And so I think that's for us, certainly in the States, that's a part of, frankly, capitalism. You're not going to get maybe the better risk because they may leave you and go somewhere else where they feel that they might get a better chance at getting coverage and getting it equitably.
If you'll allow me, say we found 3 C's. There's correlation, there's causation, and now you've introduced competition. That actually competition helps and is intimately related with this. So that's really interesting. Before I turn to Pancho, let's just see whether the polling is aligned with what we have heard. What we have heard so far. So I hope we have the polling results. Okay, look at that. Isn't that interesting? There's a very strong sense that yes, it is very much related. Having good inclusion, diversity, and equity is very strongly related with having better governance and decision making. I think that's a real. I wouldn't have said we'd have such a sort of a strong clustering there. So that's really interesting to see. Maybe if I can turn then to Pancho. So from the insurers' side of things, how do you think about the increased focus by supervisors on these issues, and what lessons are there indeed from Latin America?
Yes. Well, as I mentioned, we think that the D&I issue is considered a priority by supervisors, and it's not considered only by supervisors. As I mentioned, it is a United Nations goal. It is also a G20 priority. So there are too many actors in the world that are focused on D&I. Right? Until now, we see that in Latin America, we have been more focused in insurance inclusion than in diversity and inequity. But with no doubt, we are seeing that governments, politicians, and of course, in the future, and now supervisors, will be focusing in diversity and in equity. And as experiences that we have in Latin America working in inclusion, and perhaps this could help in the future in working in diversity and in equity, we have a lot of lessons that we learn working in insurance inclusion. It's important to mention that in 2019, we signed an agreement with Microinsurance Network and the ILO in order to work in Latin America in insurance inclusion. I would like to share with you some or the main lessons that we have working with the Microinsurance Network and the ILO in Latin America. We learned that collecting and disclosing information is really relevant to the insurance market. In Latin America, it helped us a lot to work in insurance inclusion. Another lesson is that recognizing the barriers and opportunities in the region serve as inputs for the formulation of our inclusive agenda. And finally, the relevance of visualizing challenger trends and sharing success projects as learning opportunities to the industry. This is a really wonderful lesson because in each meeting of our Inclusive Insurance Working Group, we share an experience, and a successful experience that has been working in the last year in Latin America. In agricultural sectors and special women product designs, and etc. We have done in Latin America, and it's important to mention also, 2 surveys with relevant information for the inclusive insurance market. We have been mainly focused on products, distribution channels, consumer protection, and of course in regulation. Based on these surveys, we have proposed recommendations to our members in order to support the region in developing in the inclusive insurance market. I hope to answer your question, Jerry.
Very much, Pancho. Maybe a question. So when you make that distinction, and there are very distinct concepts in play here, when you made the distinction between inclusion and diversity, maybe on asking, this is a bit of a hard question, so forgive me, but when it comes to diversity within insurance companies, do you feel that there's a sense of, well, the regulators are on this now, the regulators are going to chase us, we better get diverse, or do you feel, as you described for inclusion, that actually it's the firms themselves think, maybe for the reasons that Clara described, competition, outcomes, we should get ahead of this? Where would you say the line
Well,
is?
we are now. Yes. We are seeing and looking all around Latin America that governments, politicians, social organizations are becoming, mainly in the past 2 years, are becoming to focus more and more in diversity and equity. So if we want to really well serve to all the customers, to our own clients, and to the society, it's not a matter of regulation. It's not a matter of being compliant with supervisors. It's a matter to focus on serve our communities. We have we are going to begin to see a large demand on diversity and equity. So it's better that we begin to focus on. If not, we are going to be out of the market.
Thanks, thank you, Pancho. Fundi, thank you for your patience. Let me turn to you on this question. Maybe two questions in one, if I may. First of all, what is your sense around the evidence and the imperative that diversity, equity, inclusion does deliver better governance and decision-making outcomes? That's the first. And secondly then, because you're also a banking regulator, is there any things that we can learn either from the banking side to the insurance side or vice versa? Have you noticed differences in that context?
Yeah, so I would say that going back to what Helen highlighted earlier, so when you look at entities that have had problems, I certainly think that what one does find there, that it is generally in areas where, or in entities that don't have diverse thinking. And I would say part of the evidence that one would see, which would support the need for diversity, is in entities where there is either a strong CEO, or you find that it's a board that is founder-led, where there's entrenched thinking in particular areas and not sufficient challenge either to management or challenge to the board itself, where you found that some bad decisions were made or risks are not managed properly. So that has certainly been our experience in that regard. And I would say that diversity, where we've seen the importance of it, is just in breaking that group think and in having constructive challenge and healthy conversations within the boards themselves. What we have found also is if there isn't sufficient diversity in boards of insurers where the nature of the business is changing, that also presents some risks, because you're looking at a very different entity than what you had 10 years ago, than what you had 20 years ago. So the boards that have had that broad approach in understanding the importance of diversity and utilizing new board members effectively, utilizing the new additions to their management teams and having diverse staff, even at product development level, one does start to see big changes in terms of product offering alongside the enhancement of governance measures where it is the entity that's self-regulating. And I think this is positive on our side. Those are the experience that we're seeing. You get individuals that are joining from different boards who have seen a bit more of the world, or they join from other diverse institutions. They start to ask the right questions about, well, why are things happening like this here? And we found that it certainly has enhanced the governance side of things as well. Now, if I were to look at banking and insurers, I would say that on the banking side, we probably started to see a shift to have more diverse boards, a lot sooner than among insurers. But the issues of discussion, I think that have been important, where I would say the insurers are way ahead of banks, have been in the area of conduct and how does one think about treating customers fairly and bringing that into conversation and hiring people who understand that type of work in the banking boards and bringing in that type of thinking. I would say on the insurance side, we probably are a lot more ahead of the banking side. But the legislative framework for insurers is also, because it's newer in the South African context, I think that we are very specific about the importance of having transformation, of having diversity as an imperative there in the Insurance Act than we do in the banking legislation. So in that regard, probably the insurers are slightly ahead of the banks. But certainly in terms of the mix of the boards, I would say that probably the banks had female representation a lot sooner than some insurers did. But we're certainly seeing progress along the same lines where the language is starting to match. And also for certain banking groups, we had some banking groups that had insurers in them where you had that cultural infusion. What we are starting to focus a lot more as a supervisor at present, including our colleagues on the conduct side, the financial sector, conduct authority, is the skills mix to enhance the governance side, to say, well, diversity is also about the skills mix as well, to focus a lot more on lowering the risks related to groupthink. So thanks.
Thanks, Fundi. So I mean, again, really struck by your two examples there at the start. The sort of the example of an overly strong CEO. One example of sort of cultural problems. The other example you gave then was sort of where you have entrenched groupthink or a deferential board. And it sort of brought me, even as I was thinking, as you were then describing how diversity can help address those problems. Again, I was brought back to what you said earlier, which is that it needs to be meaningful diversity. So it's meaningful diversity if it is truly, strong voices representing diverse perspectives as opposed to maybe numerical diversity. So I think that's quite interesting. I was also very interested to hear what you say about the insurance sector being ahead of the banking sector in relation to the treating customer fairly. I think that's a very interesting insight for us to reflect on. Before I turn us to the next topic, I mean, one thing that I thought is the sort of the theme of this round was the evidence. I think one stream of work that I have followed a little bit is the work that's been done by McKinsey and is publicly available. I mean, it's pretty powerful in terms of its coverage of a large number of corporates and the correlations and causations between high levels of diversity and commitment to meaningful diversity and actual performance. It's a fairly striking series of reports, so a little bit of evidence to add into that discussion. Let me turn us to the next question, which is coming back to this aspect of diversity, equity, inclusion, and consumer outcomes. So we have a polling question. It's the last polling question, so if you're exhausted with polling questions, this is the last one. Let's see where we go on this. And the question is, to what extent does greater diversity lead to better consumer outcomes? And you have three choices: significantly better outcomes, marginally better outcomes, or makes no difference. And let's see where that poll takes us. Okay, we've got the results straight up. That was a new departure, a surprise to me, but keeps us all on our toes. So there we go. Also interesting, sort of aligned to our last poll, which is a strong majority, very strong majority in the overall better, and then even a very strong majority in the significantly better. So that is interesting to see. So building on that, maybe Fundy, if I can turn back to you. Given the prominence of racial justice as a significant concern in South Africa, as you've described, as well as in many other places, of course, what role, from your point of view, can and do insurers have to play in ensuring better outcomes for consumers and citizens in relation to race issues?
Okay, so I think Laura touched on this in her earlier comment, which is that it's important for insurers to be a reflection of the individuals that they're trying to protect, the same consumers that they're trying to protect. And in South Africa, we certainly had some examples. So I'll just cite a number of areas. So we focused over the last few years on unfair business practices, on areas of exclusion through certain practices. We've had a few examples that some of them relate to advertising per se, on how certain product offerings are presented. So even looking at something as basic as that, where you would have a Father's Day advert and what would generally be portrayed in that regard, and how certain practices are seen, from just things like advertising material in terms of who is it that you're selling to. Our colleagues at the Financial Sector Conduct Authority have focused on how insurers should be treating customers fairly throughout the product life cycle, and that's an area of engagement that they've had over the past few years, basically saying from product design through to promotion, through to the handling of claims by an insurer. This has to be part of broad thinking. I had probably about 2 months ago an interaction with the chair of an insurance board, and he was sharing with me some of the examples of having certain individuals in their insurer, just relating to, well, the experience of before that individual had joined the insurer, they didn't have a clue on how to deal with issues that related to migrant workers where they couldn't trace specific beneficiaries, and they had to think through with the board and the management where they were sitting on a large reserve fund, a pool of funds, where the beneficiaries could not be traced, and they had to think proactively on how do we trace these beneficiaries, where do we start, in a rural setting, what type of conversations should we be having with communities, and how that started to improve some of the outcomes that they had. And I think that's an example of how having people who have got that experience with certain consumer segments can help the insurer in itself. Another example that we had in South Africa was with the prevalence of HIV in South Africa, how did one have to think about designing products and communicating positively, and how to deal with this issue around discrimination, because we did have a situation in which HIV prevalence was within a certain race group or within a certain age group as well, how to deal with that segment of the population, and how insurers could present their product offering without stigmatizing a situation and a problem that existed. More recently, we also had flooding in a certain part of the country, and there it was useful for us to have this conversation with insurers about how to have conversations about pricing, how to communicate clearly about premium changes, and how to relate these to underwriting models, because unlike in the Australian context, this is a very new area for us. We haven't had large flooding or large climate-related events in South Africa. And so I think here we've had examples where the diversity of the teams in the insurers themselves have enabled insurers to engage on how to think about these issues, how to communicate about the issues, how to design better products as well, and also how to communicate with their clientele in a meaningful way by having individuals who are familiar or have worked with consumers differently, or individuals who come from those communities. And we've certainly seen enhancements in those consumer outcomes. Finally, let me just talk about something as simple as funeral policies. We've also seen within something as specific as a funeral policy, a broadening of the offerings that recognizes certain cultural requirements. So those are like small little nuances where we started to see small shifts in offerings, and also shifts in offerings in understanding young and youth consumers and how they shop, and we've certainly seen those benefits coming through in the thinking of the boards as well. So certainly we've seen that this diversity of thinking within the boards, this broad level of thinking, the broadening of the boards, introducing individuals from other entities has been important, but it's also been important from a risk management perspective in terms of pricing risks correctly as well. So alongside broadening the product offering and pricing also correctly in terms of end user pricing, or offering some slightly differentiated products so that you are covering the same risk, but you're covering it differently according to the needs of the end users.
Thanks, Fundi. That's a very rich and insightful tapestry of how sort of the diversity and representation and feeds through, and you particularly called out, and I'm going to ask Clora about this, sort of the design, the product design and communication. Again, very, very nice way of seeing the connections. Clora, would that resonate with you? So when you think about the things you were telling about us earlier on, about that focus on getting the outcomes for the community. When Fundy talks about sort of the importance of the design of products and then the communication about products and about about events and about pricing, are those the areas that resonate for you, or, and would you see others as well?
One of the, when Fundy was talking, I was thinking about when you're talking about the commercials and the things that they put out there, the advertisement or whatever. I've talked to a company that's saying, like, what were you trying to do? They responded as to where they were going, but they weren't, I wasn't particularly, I was told, I wasn't particularly looking for that segment of the population. I'm not trying to cover that segment of the population. And to which I asked, well, why? Why would you let that segment of the population be sort of out there? And it's like, we just never really thought they would be interested in that particular product. And so it's like, again, it's linear thinking. I don't think that anybody would want this. I don't really invite anybody else's thoughts or ideas. And so I'm going to run with just this product to this particular community. And it might be embraced by another community, but you might turn them off by how you advertise it.
Very interesting. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to start getting into trouble soon. Maybe turn to Helen, because I do want to open up to the floor. Helen, maybe quite briefly, because there's quite a lot that could be said, but as the IAIS takes forward its work in this area, what is the likely focus in terms of considering consumer outcomes through the DE&I lens?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important area, and what Fundy and Clara said kind of resonate quite well, I think, with the IAIS focus on this. It is about actually thinking about what a genuine consumer focus looks like, as opposed to a lot of insurers say they want to focus on the end consumer, but actually putting that into practice is quite challenging. So I think the focus of the IAIS will be very much about trying to understand the different dimensions and ways in which customers could be treated unfairly through the insurance product life cycle, and then how would we identify that as supervisors? How would we respond to it? What are the tools that are available to us so that we can move forward with providing advice and guidance to both supervisors and the industry about how they can genuinely embed a focus on financial inclusion, a focus on treating customers fairly in the way they run their business, in designing and delivering and managing products that meet the needs of users, meet the expectations of users, and treat them in a fair and equitable way. So that's very much, I think, a part of the IAIS thinking and approach there. How do we gather that information? How do we provide advice and guidance back that will move, make progress in that regard?
Thanks, Helen. And maybe, Pancho, one final question for you before I open to the floor. From your perspective, to what extent, and this goes a little bit back to what Clara was talking about, sort of the competition effects, to what extent do you see there being real commercial benefits for insurers who look to address diversity issues? And do you also agree that that sort of feeds through into better outcome for consumers?
Yes, thank you. Looking at Latin America, we have a really huge insurance gap. Perhaps no. It is what our first priority is to working in closing this gap. So if we want to focus in closing this gap, we necessarily focus on what we can call the excluded. One of the largest group excluded is that for gender. So we need to work in gender inclusion, in diversity, and we need to work in equity also if we want to close the gap. So one of the largest benefits that we can have in Latin America as insurer is working in closing this gap, and that means that we need to work in inclusion. and mainly in gender inclusion. And we're having another benefits. If we work in an adequate way, we can higher growth in sales, in our benefits, and that means that we can report to our shareholders greater benefits. And it's good for the whole industry also. In the other hand, we can mention that if we focus working in this, we have another significant drivers. We can also help to prevent potentially discriminatory practices. Society, as we mentioned, is changing, and we need to adapt to these changes if we want to be competitive and to stay in the market. So finally, focusing in DE&I is a good business.
Very powerful summation, I think, of the commercial imperative. Thanks, Nigel. So look, let me then open the floor for question. I see we have mics, I think. I see one question here. Yeah. And then I see a question here at the front afterwards. Please.
Thank you, Jerry, for the discussion. My name's John Huff. I'm with the Association of Bermuda Insurers and Reinsurers. I wanted to raise the topic of the importance of role models in leadership. Maybe I'll ask Clora Lindley Myers, the director from Missouri, and you might have to check my NAIC history here, but I think you might be the first. You're president-elect. Next year you'll be president of NAIC, and I think after 151 years, you'll be the first woman of color, the first black female president of the NAIC. And I'm just curious, what's the significance of that election to you, but maybe more importantly, what's the significance of you being in that role in the world's largest insurance market as a role model?
Well,
thanks, John. Laura, please.
Thanks for the heckle. I guess, for me, it's I've been doing this for a long time. It seems, in the scope of things, in the scheme of things, it's a long time overdue. But I also don't know that, I look at myself as a role model. I have always wanted to do right, listen to as many people as I possibly can, and be inclusive. That has been my life, because I have been excluded. And so I understand what that's like. I've been excluded as an African American woman. I've been excluded, in so many other instances. So, being African American, being a woman, and a lot of times I think I had this conversation with someone yesterday at lunch. I have been that only person that's there, only person of color, only girl. And so it is important, I think, to get a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different thoughts and ideas, and it is a position that I don't take lightly, but I also know that I have, even though I've lived this long and been around for this amount of time, there's still more for me to learn. So I do think that, being in this particular position, it is certainly something that I don't take lightly, but I also do encouragements. And it's not just people who are African American. It is all people of color, and it is, frankly, all people. So I do think that, it is, it's going to be hard for me to follow Dean Cameron, but, I'm willing to do, take it on the chin and do whatever I need to do.
Thank you, Clora, very much. I have a question here.
Florian Wimber, Insurance Island. And Jerry, I know where you are, so this question is not to you. I would like to turn to a slightly different topic and the role of the IAIS in terms of where do we have barriers in the practical implementation of diversity and inclusion strategies in the governance of insurance undertakings, where does potentially regulatory barriers exist, and where could the IAS play a significant role in identifying best practices on the company side, on the supervisory side, but also on the regulatory side? Do panelists foresee such processes either for their own markets or for the work at IAS? I'm sorry for the background noise.
Well, thanks, Florian. I think it's a good question. Maybe I'll turn to Helen. I don't know, Helen, if you managed to hear the question, which is effectively around the IAS's role and whether there's something in the space of regulatory barriers and also developing best practices that would be helpful. Get your reflections on that, Helen.
Yes, I think the stocktake survey information that we have is quite helpful here in terms of identifying what some of those barriers are in different jurisdictions, and that's given us a sort of a good base to take forward. So the work going forward, particularly led by the governance working group, will try and sort of build out, I think, areas where we've seen good practice, draw on the insights and experiences of supervisors that have made progress, but also of those where they face challenges, whether they be regulatory, legislative, or other barriers. And how do we pull together some guidance and information that can go both to the industry and to supervisors themselves about ways in which some of those barriers might be able to be addressed. Now, I think we do have to be very cognizant that there is a wide diversity of jurisdictions around the world, a wide diversity of legislative frameworks and approaches, and actually a wide diversity in the ways in which issues around diversity, equity, inclusion may manifest. What are the priority areas to focus on, and where is change most needed? And so I think initially the IAS approach will be very much around sort of developing application papers and more guidance and better practice. And then evolve over time to perhaps see where we can take the work. But that is very much the focus of what we're going to try and do in this next phase.
Thanks, Helen, very much. I'm conscious that the physical time here in the room in Santiago is 5:32, so we have on our agenda to finish at 5:30, and it's been a long day for people. I want to let you get away and have some of the other benefits of all being together at a conference like this. So let me draw the conversation to a close. It's been my absolute privilege, I have to say, to be part of this discussion. I have come away having learned a lot and received many insights. So thank you all. I want to thank very much Helen, Fundy, Clora and Pancho. It has been a really helpful conference. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the first day of the annual conference. I've been asked to remind you that proceedings will start again at 9 a.m. sharp tomorrow morning when Regina will take over as moderator. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you very much for your participation in this, and look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you.